Every one of these plants was recommended to you by a garden center, by a YouTube video, by a friend who said it's easy, just put it in the ground. What nobody told you is what happens next. Some of them you will still be pulling out in 5 years. Some of them you will never fully remove. And a few of them, the most useful, the most productive, the most extraordinary things growing in your garden, will quietly outlast everything else you ever planted. This isn't a warning against growing them, it's the information you should have had before you did. There is a particular type of frustration in gardening that nobody really names. It's not the frustration of failure, it's the frustration of unexpected success, of a plant doing exactly what plants do, and you having no framework to deal with it. You planted it in the right place, you watered it correctly, you did everything you were told, and then it started coming back, and taking over the bed next to it, and seeding itself into the cracks of your path. And you found yourself, 3 summers later, pulling the same root out of the same corner and wondering whether you made a mistake. You didn't make a mistake, but you weren't given the full picture. These are not rare plants. Most of them are in every garden center in the country, labeled as easy grows, beginner-friendly, low maintenance. What the label doesn't say is that low maintenance sometimes means essentially permanent. Here are the ones worth knowing about before you plant them, and more importantly, what to do with them once you understand what they actually are. Start with mint, because everyone knows it and almost nobody respects it enough. You have probably grown mint, or tried to, or watched it take over a container you planted it in alongside 3 other herbs that no longer exist. Mint spreads by underground runners, rhizomes, that move horizontally through soil looking for space. They are efficient in a way that feels almost deliberate. They will cross the boundary between beds. They will come up through the gaps in paving slabs. If you plant mint in open ground, the decision about where it grows is no longer fully yours. Here is the part most people get wrong. They treat this as a problem to solve. It isn't. It's a property to manage. Mint planted in a buried container, a pot sunk into the bed with its rim just above soil level, produces prolifically and stays where you put it. The runners hit the edge and stop. You get all the growth and none of the spread. The knowledge was always available. The instruction at point of sale was not. There are dozens of mint varieties: spearmint, peppermint, chocolate mint, apple mint, Moroccan mint, each with a different profile, a different culinary use, a different strength of flavor. The garden center sells you mint, singular, as though the category has one member. It doesn't. And the ones worth growing are not always the ones in the small plastic pot by the till. Lemon balm is mint's quieter, better-smelling cousin, and it is arguably more difficult to contain. It spreads by runners in the same way mint does. But lemon balm also self-seeds. If you allow it to flower, and it will flower quickly in its first season if you don't cut it back, the seed heads drop hundreds of seeds directly into the soil around it. Next spring, you will find lemon balm in places you never planted it. Here's what I genuinely didn't expect the first time I grew it seriously. The self-seeded plants are not a nuisance if you adjust your frame. They are free plants. Transplant them when they're small, pot them up, give them away, use them. Lemon balm makes exceptional tea. It has genuine calming properties. The research on this is solid, not folk medicine mythology. It attracts pollinators at a rate that is remarkable even in a busy garden. The mechanism of its spread is not malicious, it is simply optimized for survival. This plant has been growing in gardens in Europe for over 2,000 years. It survived because it is good at surviving. That same quality that makes it persistent makes it useful in ways that most of the plants you will buy this season are not. Cut it back hard after the first flush of flowers. It will regrow quickly. Do this twice a year, and you have a plant that gives you harvests, pollinators, and stays manageable. Let it go to seed, and you have a decision to make about your relationship with the concept of control. Chives are everywhere. On every beginner's list, on every grow-your-own shelf, frequently described as the easiest herb you can grow. They are also perennial. They come back every year from the same clump, which slowly expands. They divide readily. You can split one clump into 6 or 8 and plant them throughout the garden. And if you leave the flowers on, the purple globe-shaped flowers that bees absolutely cannot resist, they will set seed, and those seeds will germinate the following year in the soil around them. This is not a disaster. I want to be clear about that. But it is something you should know before you let the flowers go over. Here is the piece of information that is worth the entire price of admission. Chive flowers are edible, the whole flower head. Pull the petals apart and scatter them through a salad, and you get a mild onion flavor that is genuinely excellent. Most people grow chives for months, watch the flowers appear, and cut them back before they open because they think flowering means the plant is going over. It doesn't. It means the plant is at peak usefulness, if you know what you're looking at. The garlic chive, flat-leafed, white-flowered, stronger flavor, self-seeds even more enthusiastically than standard chives. Some people find this a problem. Some people find they always have garlic chives. The outcome is the same. The interpretation differs. If you are half listening, I need your full attention for this next part, because the plants I've described so far are manageable. They spread, they seed. You can work with them if you know what they're doing. The next group are different. These are plants that, once established in open ground, are genuinely difficult to remove, not impossible, but the kind of difficult that involves multiple seasons, persistent effort, and an acceptance that you may not fully win. I am not telling you not to grow them. Some of them are among the most valuable things you could put in a productive garden. I am telling you where to put them, and what you're agreeing to if you plant them in the wrong place. Jerusalem artichokes produce abundantly. That is not in question. You plant the tubers in spring, the plants grow to 2 meters or more by autumn, and you dig up far more than you put in. The yield-to-effort ratio is almost unprecedented in a vegetable garden. What you will also discover is that no matter how carefully you dig, you will miss tubers. Small ones, broken ones, pieces you couldn't see. Each of those pieces will produce a full plant the following year. Jerusalem artichokes do not distinguish between being harvested and being divided. Every fragment of tuber is a new plant, in a dedicated bed, ideally with a physical barrier at the edges. This is a feature. You plant once and you harvest every year indefinitely. The bed essentially manages itself. That is an extraordinary thing for a food crop to do. In a mixed bed, in open ground, next to other vegetables you actually want, this becomes a slow conquest. The plants are tall enough to shade everything around them. The tubers spread further each year. After 3 or 4 seasons, you are no longer growing a mixed bed. You are growing Jerusalem artichokes with some other things trying to survive at the margins. The flavor is worth understanding before you commit. Raw, they have a crisp, slightly nutty, slightly sweet quality. Cooked, they become rich, almost meaty, with a texture not unlike a floury potato. They are also notably high in inulin, a prebiotic fiber that many people find produces significant digestive effects when consumed in large quantities. Start small. A contained bed of 4 or 5 tubers. Learn what the harvest looks like. Learn what the plant does in measured amounts before you make it a dietary staple. The plant itself is forgiving. Comfrey has one of the deepest root systems of any plant you are likely to grow in a garden context. The taproot can reach 2 meters. The lateral roots extend significantly beyond the visible crown of the plant. This matters because comfrey cannot be removed by pulling. The root breaks. Every piece of root that remains in the soil is capable of producing a new plant. Dig it out and you are not removing it. You are dividing it. The more aggressively you attempt to remove established comfrey, the more of it you will have. This sounds like a problem. It is not. Comfrey leaves are extraordinarily high in potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus, the primary macronutrients that plants need. Used as a mulch, as a liquid feed, or composted, they produce nutrients at a concentration that rivals commercial fertilizers. This is not a folk gardening claim, it is measurable chemistry. The Russian variety, Bocking 14, is the one most serious growers use. It was developed specifically to be a hybrid that does not produce viable seed. It spreads only by root. Plant it somewhere permanent, somewhere you will not be digging, somewhere you accept it will always be, and it becomes a permanent fertility station for everything around it. Plant it at the edges, against a fence, at the base of fruit trees, in a dedicated patch that you will never disturb. Give it a permanent home and it will work for your garden indefinitely. Try to manage it like an annual and you will lose. Horseradish grows from root cuttings. A piece of root the diameter of a pencil planted horizontally 10 centimeters below the surface will produce a full plant by autumn. A crown division will produce multiple plants. And the roots, the part you want, the part that contains the sharp, volatile flavor compounds that make horseradish what it is, grow deep, branch laterally, and break apart when dug. You will not remove horseradish by digging, not fully, not unless you excavate to a depth and width that is genuinely impractical in most garden contexts. Any piece of root remaining, any fragment at any depth, will regenerate. This is why horseradish was traditionally grown in dedicated raised beds with solid bases. Not because it needs particularly good soil, because that physical barrier is the only reliable way to define its territory. The flavor compounds in fresh horseradish are volatile. They degrade quickly after the root is grated or processed. The horseradish sauce from a jar is a distant approximation of what freshly grated root tastes like. If you have ever made your own from fresh dug root, you will understand why people who grow it consider the commercial product almost a different ingredient. You can grow horseradish. It is worth growing. But the decision about where it goes is, in a very real sense, a permanent decision. Choose that location knowing you are not choosing it for this season. You are choosing it for the duration of your time in that garden. Possibly longer. Fennel is a different category of problem. Most spreading plants compete for space through physical occupation. Roots, runners, tubers. Fennel does this too, self-seeding prolifically if the flower heads are not removed before they ripen. One plant in its second year can produce thousands of viable seeds, and fennel seed germinates readily in almost any open soil. But fennel also produces allelopathic compounds, chemicals released from its roots, and decomposing leaves that inhibit the germination and growth of other plants nearby. This is documented. Tomatoes are notably sensitive to it. Fennel growing in a mixed vegetable bed is not a neutral presence. It is actively competing not just for light and water, but through chemistry. The bronze fennel, the ornamental variety, is the one most commonly sold. It is genuinely beautiful. The dark, feathery foliage and yellow flower heads are architecturally striking in a way that few vegetables or herbs manage. It earns its space on visual terms alone, but it seeds with exactly the same enthusiasm as the green variety, and the allelopathic effects are the same. Grow fennel at the edges of the garden, away from the main vegetable beds, in its own space where its chemistry affects primarily itself. Harvest the fronds regularly, fennel fronds with fish, with cucumber, pulled through a salad, and cut the flower heads before they ripen if you do not want the seeds. Fennel that you manage is one of the most productive and versatile herbs you can grow. Fennel that you ignore will slowly renegotiate the terms of its placement. Sorrel is worth ending on because it is perhaps the most underused plant in this list and the most misunderstood in terms of its behavior. It is perennial. It grows from a deep taproot that, like comfrey and horseradish, is not fully removable once established. It self-seeds from its tall flower spikes if those are allowed to ripen. The leaves emerge early, often in February in a mild year, and the plant produces through most of the season with almost no intervention. The flavor is sharp, lemony, acidic in a way that is unlike anything else in the vegetable garden. In French cooking, it has been a staple ingredient for centuries. In most Irish and British gardens, it is essentially unknown. The gap between its usefulness and its visibility is one of the stranger absences in domestic horticulture. What the garden centre does not tell you is that the sorrel you buy, French sorrel or common sorrel, will not leave the spot you put it in. It will be there next year and the year after. If it flowers and seeds, it will gradually appear in the surrounding soil. This is not a problem, it is a characteristic. Know it before you plant it. There is a pattern running through every plant in this list. All of them are perennial or semi-perennial. All of them have developed strategies, root systems, seed production, vegetative spread, oriented toward persistence rather than a single season. All of them would be considered extremely low input once established. All of them produce returns over years, not weeks. And almost none of them are marketed at the beginning of the gardening season. Not prominently. Not with the same energy as the seed packets and the annual bedding plants and the bags of compost. The commercial garden industry does not benefit from you building a garden full of plants you never need to buy again. Not conspiratorially, just structurally. The incentive points toward replacement, toward new seasons starting with new purchases, toward annuals that require annual buying. A garden built on perennial food plants is a garden that becomes more productive and more self-sufficient over time. It is also, from a commercial standpoint, a garden that eventually needs less from the market. I almost wish I hadn't followed this as far as I did, because once you understand the mechanism, once you see why certain plants are everywhere in the literature and certain plants are almost invisible, you cannot go back to the version of the gardening world where that absence felt accidental. The plants that persist without you are not the problem. They are the design. Which one are you putting in the ground this season? Tell me in the comment, and tell me if you already have one of these and nobody warned you what was coming.